Beijing Turmoil, More Than Meets the Eye by Chi. Chapter 2. Why Was Bloodshed Inevitable? Suppression of the counter-revolutionary rebellion was China's internal affair. In order to safeguard social stability and state power, any country and government has the right to suppress by any means activity aimed at overthrowing the government. Many people of insight around the world agree to China's policy of suppressing the counter-revolutionary rebellion. Some of these expressed their understanding and sympathy. Others believed it was China's internal affair, and foreign countries, therefore, had no right to interfere. However, the United States and some Western European countries wantonly interfered in China's internal affairs. Their actions transgressed all common sense. I do not intend to comment on them here. Some others who have a feeling of friendship towards China do not understand why China used troops to quell the incident. A friend said to me, "Couldn't China have quelled the incident using peaceful means? Why couldn't the government have made some necessary concessions to the students' demands so as to avoid intensifying the struggle?" I would like to say what I think. I was in Beijing from the very beginning of the incident. I observed the incident day and night, always concerned about the students, while, at the same time, I understood the difficult predicament which the government was in. The government desired to mitigate this contradiction and solve the problem through peaceful means, but in the final event it was forced to use troops. First petition assaulting Zhongnanhai. Looking back over the development of the incident, we can see that in order to avoid hurting students who had engaged in activities impermissible to the state at the instigation of scoundrels, the government repeatedly exercised restraint. But the students continued to press forward, fermented disturbance, and escalated the incident. The behavior of Wang Dan, the students' leader, at the very beginning of the unrest, is a good example of this. In the early morning of April 18th, Wang Dan led a group of students to the Great Hall of the People and demanded to present a petition to the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. Wang and some others were led into the hall at 8 o'clock. A responsible comrade listened to their demands and received the petition. But Wang Dan and others thought of another trick. They demanded to have a dialogue with the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. In order to bring pressure to bear on the government at 3 o'clock that afternoon, they incited students to assault the Great Hall of the People. At 5 o'clock, the reception personnel told them that 3 members of the NPC Standing Committee would hold a dialogue with them, but Wang Dan changed his mind. He said that no dialogue was necessary and demanded that deputies of the NPC receive their petition at 7:50 that evening instead. At the gate to the Great Hall of the People, he said that if this demand was met, they would not ask for more. 3 deputies of the NPC received their petition at the designated time. A delegation of foreign reporters who were previously informed of the event photographed the scene. They got the publicity they wanted, but things did not end there. Next, Wang Dan led the people to the Xinhuamen Gate of Zhongnanhai to create disturbance. More than 2,000 people gathered in front of Xinhuamen Gate, blocking Chang'an Avenue, Beijing's main artery of traffic. They assaulted Xinhuamen Gate at every half an hour, wounding guards. The incident lasted from the evening of April 18th until early in the morning of the next day. At 4:20 a.m. on April 19th, the Beijing municipal government made an announcement over the loudspeakers saying that assaulting party and government offices was against the law and thus asked people to leave the place. With the persuasion of the office staff and policemen, the crowd gradually dispersed. But things did not end there either. From the evening of April 19th to the early morning of April 20th, at the instigation of Wang Dan and others, hundreds of students assaulted Xinhuamen Gate. Some people made incisive speeches, others hurled bricks and soft drink bottles at policemen, wounding 4. The situation escalated. The policemen exercised restraint. They tried to persuade the students to leave. More than 200 students created a disturbance until early the next day, when the government forced them into buses and sent them back to school. No one was arrested or detained. The next day, a rumor spread in the city that policemen had beaten the students, that many people had been knocked down in the bloodshed. They fabricated the April 20th bloodshed rumor. Using the hunger strike as a means of coercion. Between May 15th and 18th, Mikhail Gorbachev visited China and held talks with Chinese leaders. This event attracted the whole world's attention. According to the original schedule, the welcoming ceremony was to be held in Tiananmen Square, and Gorbachev was to lay a wreath on the monument to the people's heroes in the square. But since the students who occupied the square turned a deaf ear to the advice of the government and people from all walks of life, and refused to withdraw, the schedule had to be changed, and for the same reason the meeting between Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping was delayed for 2 hours. But still the Chinese government did not force the students to withdraw from the square. Nor did they arrest students. During these days I was incensed by the students' behavior. They had put the government in an awkward position. Now, it was clear that the bad student leaders had deliberately chosen Gorbachev's visit as the day for the commencement of the hunger strike in order to ridicule the Chinese government. The hunger strike challenged the government. However, the government ordered Beijing municipality to protect the student hunger strikers and ensure that no students die as a result of the hunger strike. Beijing municipal government, through the Red Cross, assigned more than 10,000 doctors and nurses and over 100 ambulances to the square to care for the students. 2,000 beds in 52 hospitals were emptied so that hunger strikers who might be suffering from shock or other illnesses related to their fast could be treated in time. To keep the square clean, makeshift lavatories were set up. Sanitary workers gave the square a good cleaning at night. Rain was forecast on May 18th. 78 buses were assigned to provide shelter for the hunger strikers, but concessions and the consideration shown on the part of the government did not result in any positive reaction from the students. The hunger strikers' demand was that the government hold a dialogue with them. A big banner at the square read, "Hunger strike and class boycott. We demand a dialogue." People who did not know the truth thought that if the government had met these demands, everything would have been fine. People from all walks of life who supported the hunger strikers also asked the government to hold a dialogue with the students. For a time, it was public opinion that the government had delayed the dialogue, was indifferent to the fate of the students, and was inhumane. The truth was different. From the beginning, the government had adopted a positive attitude towards holding a dialogue. At 2 o'clock on May 13th, representatives of the Autonomous Union of University Students had put forward their demand for a dialogue. At 4 o'clock, the Central Committee's General Office and the State Council's General Office had agreed. But after daybreak, the student representatives changed their mind, and the dialogue was canceled. On the morning of May 13th, the General Office of the Party Central Committee and the Bureau for Letters and Visits of the Standing Committee of the NPC told them once again that a dialogue would be held on May 15th. They agreed. First, they proposed a list of 20 persons. After the government agreed, they demanded that the list be increased to 200 persons. Before the government had had a full discussion about it, they complained that the government was insincere with regard to holding a dialogue. Only 4 hours after they had received the notice of holding a dialogue, they started the hunger strike to protest at the government's delay in holding the dialogue. Actually, they had already taken the decision to hold the hunger strike on May 11th. Asking the government to hold a dialogue was therefore a ruse to whip up public opinion. Desire for negotiation, not dialogue. Although the leaders of the Autonomous Union of University Students willfully made trouble, the government still sought to hold dialogues with them through different channels. In the early morning of May 14th, Politburo members Li Tieying and Li Shiming and State Councilor and Beijing Mayor Chen Shitong went to Tiananmen Square and tried to persuade the students to go back to their universities and answered many of their questions. This was actually a dialogue. On the afternoon of May 14th, Li Tieying, Yan Mingfu, member of the CPC Secretariat, and Wei Jianxing, Minister for Supervision, held a sincere dialogue with representatives from more than 30 universities, including representatives of the hunger strikers. The dialogue continued for 3 hours the next day. At 5 o'clock in the morning of May 18th, as soon as they had finished Sino-Soviet talks, members of the Standing Committee of the Political Bureau of the CPC Central Committee went to the hospital to see hunger strikers and talked with them. In the morning, Li Peng, Li Tieying, Li Shiming, Yan Mingfu and Chen Shitong met with representatives of the hunger strikers, Wang Dan, Wu Kaishi, and others in the Great Hall of the People. They listened to the suggestions and demands of the students and explained the opinion of the party and government. Was this a dialogue of the highest level? Wu Kaishi claimed, "This is not a dialogue, it's a meeting." Then what is meant by a dialogue? On May 2nd, the Autonomous Union of University Students presented 12 demands for the dialogue. To cite a few, both parties should have the same opportunity to speak. The dialogue should be held in places designated by both parties in turn. And in order to guarantee the legality of the dialogue, both parties should issue a joint communiqué and sign it, etc. Demanding such harsh terms, they considered themselves as the opposition and wanted to negotiate with the government. How could this be called a dialogue? On May 2nd, a big character poster was put up in Tsinghua University entitled, "To the Negotiation Table." It said, "We will go to the negotiation table, not the dialogue table." The people who engineered the turmoil used dialogue as a pretext to confuse people, ferment disturbance, and pressurize the government into negotiating with them and making concessions to enable them to reach their political aims. Wang Dan published an article in the United States saying, "We shall establish a Western-style political system and get rid of the outmoded political ideology." Although the government made concessions, they would not stop until they had reached their goal. The occupation of Tiananmen Square. Since the hunger strikers occupied Tiananmen Square on May 13th, the situation in Beijing, as well as the country as a whole, deteriorated. The government had no choice but to take strong measures. People behind the scenes were so sinister that they had used the hunger strike to deepen the turmoil. In mid-April, someone said to Wang Dan, "Hunger striking can be used. Start a hunger strike in Tiananmen Square. The students will fall down one after another, and the shriek of ambulances will be heard on the streets. Citizens will come out to watch. Any government which is concerned about saving face will be unable to ignore them." Fang Lizhi encouraged Wang Dan. 2 days after the hunger strike begins, the government will surrender. They purposefully chose May 13th to start the hunger strike because Gorbachev was scheduled to arrive in Beijing 2 days later. They intended to ridicule the government in front of the Soviet guests and foreign reporters. Although the students' hunger strike was not real, some took turns fasting, others ate bread and cakes and chocolate. Nevertheless, the 7-day hunger strike with more than 3,000 participants really shocked Beijing and China. Tiananmen Square had been the source of the turmoil since it was first occupied. People made speeches to attack the government and to spread political rumors. Illegal organizations were established to plan anti-government activities. Students from 85 different universities and colleges in various parts of the country came to the square to participate in the hunger strike or to support the fasting students. Demonstrations occurred in 84 cities throughout the country. The hunger strike continued. More and more people joined in the demonstrations to support the students. From tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, the hunger strikers could not stop. Some hunger strikers said, "We were like actors. The supporters were like the audience. They were so warm that we could not go off stage. The actors were so energetic that the audience would not leave either." The hunger strikers were surrounded by 5 picket lines organized by the Autonomous Union of University Students. A student said, "We were tied as a whole group. Nobody had freedom." Some parents and teachers advised students to go back. The students said, "We cannot go back even if we want to." The organizers of the turmoil kept the hunger strikers hostage in order to force the party and government to meet their political demands. They were indifferent to the health and survival of the students. Representatives from Beijing Red Cross asked the Autonomous Union of University Students to send the hunger strikers to the hospital, but were turned down. Premier Li Peng's request to allow the Red Cross to take care of the hunger strikers was harshly refused. It seemed that nothing but a decisive action could end the hunger strike and bring peace to the square. Anyone with any common sense knows that no government, ancient or modern, foreign or Chinese, would tolerate demonstrators' occupation of the central square in its capital. For over 20 days, unless it were willing to resign. Tiananmen Square is a solemn place where the government holds important ceremonies and receives state guests. The Tiananmen Gate Tower itself is the symbol of New China, which appears on the national emblem. How can such a politically important square be allowed to be occupied for a long time? Are people allowed to pitch tents on the lawn in front of the White House in the United States or in front of the Buckingham Palace in Britain? From May 15th on, demonstrators in Beijing took to the streets every day. Transportation was almost at a standstill. After May 17th, over 60 public bus routes stopped operation. Large numbers of factory and office workers could not go to work. Raw materials could not be supplied to factories. Products could not go to market. Of the 425 large and medium-sized enterprises under Beijing municipality, 35 partly stopped production and 16 totally stopped production. Workers and factory directors appealed for the turmoil to cease. Otherwise, normal production could not be resumed. Since traffic was blocked, daily necessities such as gas, briquettes, grain, vegetables, and milk could not reach residents. Mail was not delivered. Rubbish could not be cleared. Streets and public lavatories were left dirty. The normal life of citizens was disrupted. At the peak of the turmoil, student pickets replaced traffic policemen. They wantonly stopped and checked vehicles, except ambulances. A Beijing vice mayor was once stopped by a student picket who wanted to check his ID card. The driver thought that if they found out the man was the vice mayor, he would be in trouble. So he told the students, "This is Mr. X of the Kuomintang Revolutionary Committee." They let him go. Some ministers and generals were stopped by student pickets on their way to attend high-level meetings. The situation had deteriorated to such an extent that any responsible government would have had to take decisive measures. Nevertheless, the anxiety in our minds remained the most unbearable thing. When I saw those democracy fighters with white cloth bands around their heads whiz past in a truck, I thought of the Red Guards with red armbands during the Cultural Revolution. Were they patriotic? If so, then why did they humiliate the Chinese people in front of foreigners? Did they want democracy? Why did they do things against the law? They even instigated high school pupils to boycott classes. If high school pupils had participated, they would have made a mess of it. When I saw children from a kindergarten near my home wear white cloth bands around their heads which read "Support the Hunger Strike," I was really grieved. Adults had created so much disturbance. Why must they pollute the minds of children, too? This state of anarchy must end. The country, the nation would benefit. This was the voice in my heart in May. The martial law enforcement troops were blocked at the city outskirts. In this mood, I and my family members had clapped our hands on the night of May 19th, when we saw on the TV Li Peng giving the speech at the meeting called by the central authorities and attended by the cadres from the party government and military institutions. When Yang Shangkun announced that some troops would be moved into the city in order to keep public order in Beijing, I realized that the government was going to enforce martial law and that the anarchic state of affairs in Beijing would come to an end. In the same evening, when the subtitles appeared on TV saying that the students at Tiananmen Square had changed the hunger strike to a sit-in, I felt great relief after so many days of strain. I went to bed in the hope that when I woke up in the morning, things would have changed for the better. However, I was awakened by the telephone ringing the following morning. I was petrified when my friend told me that most of the troops had been stopped at the city outskirts, and even though some troops had arrived in Beijing railway station by train, they were unable to get out of the station. I ran out onto the street and saw that the iron garbage cans had been put on the road as blockades, leaving a narrow passage just wide enough to allow only one bus to pass through. The students, with white cloth bands on their heads, were checking every vehicle on the street. The several public buses that run on this street were not in sight. People were talking in small groups. All the public transportation has stopped. Are workers on strike? It doesn't seem like it. How can you drive with all these blockades on the road? May they not cut the water and electricity? The situation didn't change for the better as I had expected. People started to feel uneasy again. The street that used to have buses and other motor vehicles shuttling back and forth was now so quiet. Walking along the street, I thought with a heavy heart, had the military secretly been revealed by somebody? If for none other than that reason, how could troops from several directions all be blocked? How could people without weapons stop the soldiers with weapons? The troops must have received the order that didn't allow them to fire, because their task was to keep the public order. Since they could not open fire and students and residents unaware of the truth didn't allow them to come in, how could the situation calm down? Then I had a second thought. With troops around the city, they might also represent a kind of deterrent force which might have some effect on the situation. It was not until some time later that I learned that somebody did leak out the secret. In his report on putting down the anti-government riot, Chen Shi-tong said, "At about 4 o'clock on the afternoon of May 19th, someone holding a piece of paper and identifying himself as a staff worker of a certain organization under the party central committee went to the Tiananmen Square headquarters and revealed the news that martial law was about to be declared. As a result of the close collaboration between a small number of people who had access to top party and state secrets and the organizers and schemers of the turmoil, the organizers made timely adjustment to their tactics. That night, just 45 minutes before the meeting called by the central authorities and attended by cadres from the party government and military institutions in Beijing, they changed the hunger strike to a sit-in a bid to give people the false impression that since the students had already ended their hunger strike, it was not necessary for the government to declare martial law. By so doing, they also gained time to organize people and coerce those who were in the dark to set up roadblocks at major crossroads." The soldiers, sitting on the trucks with submachine guns in their hands, were surrounded by people. Some climbed onto their trucks, asking them to revolt. Some cursed the soldiers, and some threw stones at them. Sitting silently with guns in their hands, the soldiers, as seen on TV, never resorted to insults or struck back at their assailants. People all know how powerful the Chinese People's Liberation Army is, and how bravely they fought in the War of Liberation, the Korean War, and the War of Counterattack in self-defense against the Vietnamese. If they had been allowed to shoot, these rioters and people unaware of the truth, no matter how capable they were, would not have been able to stop the troops from advancing into the city. The soldiers strictly obeyed the orders of not responding when insulted or striking back when attacked. In order to avoid a confrontation with the masses and await the understanding of the people, most of the troops withdrew on orders and were stationed in the suburbs instead of going into the city proper using force. The troops stayed in the city outskirts for 2 weeks. This once again demonstrated the restraint exercised by the party and the government. People of good sense were very clear that it was not a case of the troops being unable to go into the city, but rather that they were afraid of hurting people. The martial law is not military control or curfew. According to the order issued by Premier Li Peng, the martial law was enforced from 10 a.m. on May 20th in some areas of Beijing. There was some misunderstanding from the outside world about the precise nature of the martial law. Some thought it meant military control, which would have meant that the military would be in charge of everything. Some others thought it was a curfew, which meant no transportation or entertainment at night. Actually, martial law means neither of the above in China. The Beijing municipal government was continuing to carry out its normal work. According to the martial law order issued by Li Peng, the martial law would be implemented by the Beijing municipal government and concrete measures would be adopted in the light of specific needs. So, the martial law troops were carrying out their tasks under the leadership of the Beijing municipal government. According to the number 1 order of the Beijing municipal government, the purpose and task of the martial law was to swiftly stop the unrest and to maintain normal order of work, production, teaching, scientific research, and social life in the capital. Under the martial law, demonstrations, petitions, class boycotts, strikes, and other activities involving large numbers of people which impede the normal social order are banned. People are prohibited from using any means to create and spread rumors, establish links, make public speeches, or distribute leaflets to incite social turmoil. It is prohibited to assault leading organs of the party, the government, and the army, to assault broadcasting, television, communications, and other key units, or to sabotage important public facilities. All disruptive activities, such as beating, smashing, looting, and arson, are strictly forbidden. It is prohibited to harass embassies of all countries and agencies of the United Nations in Beijing. The public security officers, armed police, and soldiers on duty have the right to use every means possible to stop any of the above prohibited activities should they occur. Simply speaking, enforcing martial law gives the government the right to use troops to assist the public security officers and armed police maintain normal social order with respect of work, production, and ordinary daily life, and put a stop to social unrest. Why should the regular troops join the public security officers and armed police, since their task was chiefly to maintain social order? This is a question which many foreign friends have asked. As a matter of fact, no one had anticipated that social unrest on such a large scale would occur in Beijing. Therefore, the number of public security officers and armed police in Beijing were insufficient to cope with unrest on this scale, and these were already exhausted from handling one incident after another since late April, compared with the numbers and force of the people involved in the unrest. They were far from being able to handle the situation. Under these circumstances, some troops were summoned to the city to assist the public security personnel and armed police with the martial law enforcement. I had a relative from another city who went to the railway station at 4 o'clock in the morning to buy a sleeper train ticket for his return trip. When he came back, I asked him if he was questioned or examined by the patrol, since he was alone at such an early hour. He told me that he brushed past the patrol, but was not questioned, and that even if he was, it would have been fine, because he had his ID card with him. From this we can see that the martial law was not a curfew, and that people were free to move about. For those who chose to abide by the law, the martial law did not interfere with their individual freedom. Rather, they were protected, which made them feel much safer. After the turmoil was quelled, everyone felt the same way. The source of unrest was not cut off. The period from May 20th, when martial law was declared, up to the time just before the unrest was put down on June 4th, was a hard time. Most of the troops were still staying outside of the city, and all the bans listed in the martial law announcement could therefore not be carried out. Thus, the situation became even worse. Tiananmen Square was still occupied. So long as the source of unrest was still there, Beijing and even the whole country could not have a moment's peace. Those plotting the unrest threatened to occupy Tiananmen Square indefinitely. They were determined to stay there in order to engineer a final confrontation with the government. On May 24th, a Defend the Square oath-taking rally was held at the square, at which Wang Dan stated that we already have no path of retreat, and that as long as we can hold on there, this incompetent government is bound to collapse. Persistence is victory. They wanted to turn the square into the epicenter and heart of a national, democratic movement. They attempted to occupy the square indefinitely, so as to control the whole country. In order to enhance their morale, the Beijing Autonomous Union of University Students erected a statue which very much resembled the Statue of Liberty in America. At first, they called it the Goddess of Liberty, but fearing this was too undisguised a title, they changed it to Goddess of Democracy. No matter what they chose to call it, everyone knew that it was the spiritual pillar of these pro-democracy fighters. Democracy and freedom. American style. At the square, the illegal organizations, such as the Autonomous Union of University Students, the Autonomous Union of Workers, and the Union for the Capital's Intelligentsia, collaborated with some members of the party who supported the unrest and schemed to overthrow the government. Wan Runan, general manager of the Stone Company, called some leaders of the AUUS together for a meeting at the Beijing International Hotel, at which he listed the following 6 conditions for retreating from the square. 1. Withdraw the troops. 2. Cancel the martial law. 3. Remove Li Peng. 4 and 5. make Deng Xiaoping and Yang Shangkun retire. And 6. Let Zhao Ziyang resume his post. Only when the government agreed to these 6 conditions could they organize as planned a grand victory march at midnight and withdraw from the square gloriously. Moreover, the Stone Research Institute of Social Development, under the direction of Wang Runyan, launched a drive to collect signatures among NPC Standing Committee members for a letter demanding the convocation of an NPC emergency meeting to rescind the martial law order and dismiss Li Peng. At this time, the slogan, "Down with Li Peng's puppet regime," was seen at the square. They spread the rumors that the foreign ministry had already broken away from the central government. Over 30 countries in the world had announced that they would not recognize the Chinese government, and the list for the new government had already been drawn up. All of this was in an attempt to overthrow the government and establish a new power in its place. At the same time, the Flying Tiger Corps, formed by over 100 motorcycles, hung around Zhongnanhai and other key departments of the central government day and night, making a threatening show. Most of the Corps members were hooligans or criminals released after serving their terms of imprisonment. During this period, the demonstrations on all levels in Beijing never stopped. In addition to the students, intellectuals also reacted strongly. I felt very worried. The troops could neither open fire nor come into the city, which meant that martial law could not be enforced. The people incited by bad people would make greater trouble whenever and wherever they pleased, and they would shout for the overthrow of whoever they wanted. It was only later that I learned that even at that moment the government still wanted to use peaceful means to solve the problem. From May 22nd to 24th, the government 3 times asked the Beijing Red Cross to send people to the square, asking the students to take the situation as a whole into consideration and withdraw from the square. From May 23rd to May 27th, the Party Central Committee, the State Council, the Beijing Municipal Party Committee, and the municipal government also sent representatives on many occasions to talk with the sit-in student representatives, trying to persuade them to leave the square. The martial law troops headquarters more than once sent people to talk with students about the situation and ask them to leave the square as soon as possible. Many of the students at the square were willing to leave, but the leaders of AUUS would not hear of it. Their senior advisor, Li Shuxian, said very clearly that the American satellite is watching you every day. You cannot leave the square. No matter how much the government gave in, it was useless. To agree to their 6 conditions would have been tantamount to handing over political power. To safeguard the government's authority, the martial law troops had to come into the city. Restraint exercised by the martial law troops. After waiting outside the city for 2 weeks, the martial law troops finally advanced towards the city at midnight. Even at this time, they were still under orders not to open fire and not to respond when insulted or strike back if attacked. Some of the troops didn't bring their weapons as they ran into the city. Some troops in plain clothes entered the city separately and without weapons, and some troops went to the city with weapons but without cartridge. All these measures were taken to avoid a confrontation with people who were ignorant of the truth and in order to avoid bloodshed. However, things sometimes go contrary to people's wishes. From 12 o'clock to midnight of June 3rd to 10 o'clock in the evening, the troops advancing to the city were blocked at major crossroads and were under attack. The situation on that day was grim and complicated, and rumors floated all over the city. An old woman told me on the telephone, "The martial law troops have entered the city. The trailblazing truck has run over students and people's feelings are running high. People have clashed with the Liberation Army. What an ugly turn things have taken." When I told him about this, my youngest son, who works at CCTV, said, "None of this story about the trailblazing truck running over students. It's a traffic accident caused by a Jeep borrowed by our TV station. It has nothing to do with the troops at all." At 10:55 on the evening of June 2nd, a police Jeep on loan to the China Central TV for use in making a film in celebration of the 40th anniversary of the People's Republic was involved in a traffic accident on its way back to its unit. The accident, in which 3 persons were killed and 1 injured, none of them students, was caused by the driver driving at too high a speed on the slippery street after a shower. The driver, Chen Fu-yu, was detained. People with ulterior motives cashed in on the accident to spread the rumor about a trailblazing truck of the martial law troops crushing 3 students to death in an attempt to incite people to block the troops from entering the city. Thus, the accident became a fuse touching off a drive to block the troops by people unaware of the truth. From the videotape, the truth concerning the riot, broadcast on CCTV, we could see that unarmed soldiers in raincoats running towards the city were beaten by a hail of stones. Some soldiers who fell behind were surrounded and beaten severely by rioters. One soldier was thrown from the flyover bridge and burned with gas. Then the burned body was hung from the bridge as an exhibit. Some soldiers were burned to death in their vehicles, and one soldier was slaughtered and disemboweled. This fascist atrocity was too horrible to look at. My son is a man who never cries, but when he saw this, he burst into tears and said, "Can you show a woman's compassion towards rioters?" On TV, we saw an officer who was also beaten and who was lying in the hospital. He was Vice Political Commissar Zhang Kun, a major general from a martial law troop. His leg and ribs were broken, and he could not turn around. It was incredible that a high-ranking officer could be injured like this. Couldn't the soldiers around him defend him? Didn't he have a pistol to defend himself? We also saw a group of Muslims who had been on a pilgrimage to Mecca going to visit the soldiers in hospital. The major general said to them, "I was leading a division to advance towards the city and my vehicle got stuck in the contingents. We had guns, but I didn't give the order to shoot." A major general who had a division under him would rather have been injured than give the order to open fire. What kind of troop is this? Later, we learned from the newspaper that at least 3 other major generals were wounded. They were Xiao Songgao, political commissar of a division, Chen Mingyi, division commander, and Zhang Mingchun, army political commissar. During these 22 hours, the rioters also looted weapons and ammunition, assaulted key government institutions, such as the Great Hall of the People, Zhongnanhai, the Ministry of Radio, Film, and Television, and the Central Propaganda Department. The leaders of AUUS and AUW distributed knives, daggers, iron bars, and iron chains, and aroused the people to take up arms to overthrow the government. All of this demonstrates that the unrest, schemed by a small number of people over the previous month, had already turned into an anti-government rebellion. Under such intolerable circumstances, the martial law troops were ordered to adopt decisive measures to put down the rebellion. Starting from 6 o'clock in the evening, the announcement of the martial law troops was broadcast on TV and radio again and again, asking students and residents not to go out onto the streets and not to impede the troops in carrying out their tasks. Sitting in front of the TV, I was so nervous I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how long I had been sitting there before I heard the gunshots from afar. Something that people with good intentions hadn't wished to see happen was happening. The troops at the crossroads exercised great restraint. When they were halted and surrounded, they were forced to shoot, mainly into the air or at the ground, to give warnings or to disperse the crowds blocking the road, throwing all cautions to the wind. Some desperados began to assail the soldiers with bricks and iron bars. It was only when their safety and lives came under direct menace that the soldiers began to fire in self-defense, killing some of the ruffians. Because there were so many onlookers and students, some people were either hit by vehicles or shot by stray bullets. People were sorry about the accidental woundings. Those onlookers who wouldn't listen to persuasion brought tremendous difficulty to the martial law troops, who ended up with great casualties. More than 6,000 soldiers and police were injured, and scores of them killed. Among more than 1,000 vehicles burned down were over 60 armored cars and 30 police cars. A number of weapons and ammunitions were looted. An army officer told people later, "If we had been allowed to let ourselves go, 1 battalion of soldiers would have been quite enough to quell the riot. But with rioters hiding behind onlookers, we had to stay our hand." A photo published in the June 19, 1989 Time magazine of the United States showed a man blocking a column of tanks with bare hands. I also saw it on TV. This man stood in front of the tanks. When the first tank turned to one side trying to dodge him, he also went to that side to block it. The tank did not crush him or open fire on him. No matter how the American media distorted the facts by using this photo, anyone with any common sense would wonder how a man with nothing in his hands could stop a column of tanks. Isn't this proof that the martial law troops had exercised great restraint? Eyewitness accounts. Please allow me to quote Professor James C. Shung of the New York University in an eyewitness account he wrote. From the midnight of June 3rd to the morning of June 4th, he saw with his own eyes from the top of the Beijing Hotel how the troops marched towards Tiananmen from the east. After midnight, I saw troops trotting, that is on foot, from the east end toward Tiananmen Square. They were without helmets and weapons. As they were approaching the square, they were blocked by huge crowds and were forced to retreat, trotting back to the direction east they had come from. On their retreat route, the troops were chased by the crowds, many throwing rocks and bricks. Not long after, troops returned by truck, this time with helmets on and weapons in hand. By then, the crowds had set up more roadblocks. As the trucks were negotiating their way through, the crowds stopped them with a barrage of rocks. This free-for-all went on for some time, during which many soldiers were either killed or wounded, and some lost their weapons to the ruffians. Then came the armored reinforcements, spitting sporadic fire, apparently in revenge, into the crowds along both sides of the road. Besides the ruffians and students, many were merely onlookers. The crowds, however, fought back hard. They climbed atop the oncoming tanks. Some even used Molotov cocktails, or the equivalents of a flamethrower, against the tanks. One tank went ablaze. As the 3 soldiers inside opened the latch to run away from the heat, some hooligans shouted, "Kill them! Kill them!" A BCC, Taipei, radio reporter on the scene recorded the shouting. He later told me that he saw the 3 soldiers killed by their maulers. A Chinese-American friend, in whose house I had been a dinner guest only 2 nights before, later called and told me that a similar attack took place in front of their apartment building. One soldier's corpse, lying by an incinerated troop carrier truck, I was told, was set on fire by his killers, who had poured gasoline on the body. In all the cases we knew, the ruffians were much older than most college students, and did not appear to be students at all. Professor Xiong stressed that he only saw troops coming from the east, not from the west, and that it was said the troops from the west were not very civilized. He was confused, because what he saw was quite a civilized troop. In other words, they didn't open fire before they were attacked or looted. How come the troops coming from the other direction should behave so differently? I have a friend who lives in an apartment building on Fu Xing Min Wei Street, across from the Ministry of Radio, Film, and Television, who watched the troops marching from the west to the east. This friend is the vice director of the Chinese literature magazine Dongliang Hui. The following is what she told me. I live on the 8th floor. Looking down from my window is the Fu Xingmin Wei Street, the one that leads to Tiananmen Square. After dinner, on June 3rd, my son said to me, "Come and have a look. The situation out there is not right." I looked down from the window and saw a group of people moving the dividing blocks made of concrete and iron bars to block the traffic. They also pushed a bus and put it across the street before setting fire to it. On the 200-meter-long section of the street in front of our building, they set up 5 roadblocks. At about 10 p.m., I heard gunshots from afar. Then I heard people shouting, "They've come! They've come!" Onlookers in the streets dispersed. But when they didn't see the troops coming, they went out again. At about midnight, the troops marched from the west. In the front was the anti-riot team of 20 soldiers with shields in their hands to clear the way. Behind them were soldiers in square formations. At the rear were vehicles, soldiers with helmets and guns walked on both sides of the vehicles. Both the vehicles and soldiers moved slowly. The soldiers clearing the way had to remove roadblocks and buses. The troops had to stop many times. When they stopped, the ruffians hiding on both sides of the street started to throw things like rocks and incendiary bottles at the soldiers. Then the troops opened fire into the air as warnings. Sometimes they also fired at the ground, whipping up sparks. I only once saw them fire at a man. He tossed a flamethrower against a vehicle and set it on fire. Then he threw something like an incendiary bottle at another vehicle, but in vain. He fell on the ground at the gunshot and was immediately taken onto a tricycle. Some people from our building and the one next to ours went out to look. I was told later that no one from these two buildings was killed. All this demonstrates that the troops from the West also exercised great restraint. They didn't shoot until attacked. In Professor Xiang's words, they were also quite civilized. She also thought the ruffians did not appear to be students at all, because they spoke dirty Beijing local dialect. The facts once again proved that those ruffians were mainly criminals released after serving a sentence, gangs of political hooligans, and dregs from the Gang of Four and from society. Rumor of the Tiananmen bloodbath. According to the official statistics, over 3,000 civilians were wounded, and among more than 200 killed, 36 were college students. The figure verified by the Beijing Higher Education Bureau showed that these 36 students came from 20 colleges and universities. Among them, 6 were from the Chinese People's University, 3 from Tsinghua University, 3 from Beijing Science and Technology University, whilst 7 other schools, including from Beijing University and Beijing Teachers University, lost 2 students each, and 10 other schools each had 1 student killed. Some of them had participated in the riot. Found in their pockets were ID cards of AUUS Dare to Die Corps, or pickets. Some were accidentally killed when spectating on the street. A leader of the Beijing Higher Education Bureau announced that none of these 36 students were killed at Tiananmen Square. Rumors from outside China claimed that Tiananmen Square was a bloodbath and over 3,000 people were killed there. But in actual fact, not a single person was killed at Tiananmen Square. The students who had for so long occupied Tiananmen Square withdrew at 5 o'clock on the morning of June 4th. During their withdrawal, the martial law troops didn't open fire at them or crush them with tanks. All the rumors and speculations abroad were not true. Up until now, no one has been able to give any proof that there were people killed during the clear-up of the square. From the TV, I saw the students walking slowly from the southeast corner of the square, carrying flags and streamers. They didn't appear to be running in panic. On June 6th, Zhang Gong, head of the political department of a martial law unit, announced at the press conference that, while carrying out their clearing task from 4:30 to 5:30 a.m. on June 4th, neither did the troops kill any students or resident, nor did they use tanks or military vehicles to crush or hit anybody. I believe what Zhang Gong said. What some other eyewitnesses told the public confirmed what Zhang Gong said, or what was shown on TV. For instance, 3 workers at the Great Hall of the People watched the whole process of clearing up the square from there. Another worker at a store to the east of the square saw everything from 1:15 to the morning of the same day. The following is the summary of their accounts. At 1:30 a.m. of June 4th, the troops arrived at the Chang'an Avenue to the north of the square. The emergency announcement of the Beijing municipal government and the martial law troops' headquarters was broadcast again and again over the loudspeakers at the square, asking people to leave there as soon as possible. During the 3 hours of the broadcasting, the troops didn't take any action. Large numbers of people left upon hearing the announcement. Student representatives asked the troops if they could be allowed to leave peacefully and voluntarily. The troops agreed immediately. They explained repeatedly through the loudspeaker that they agreed to the students leaving there as requested. The students occupying the monument to the people's heroes were still arguing as to whether they should leave or not. Later they held a spoken vote, and the majority agreed to leave. At about 4:40 a.m., students left the square in lines from the southeast corner. The troops moved slowly into the square, keeping a distance from them. By 5:30, all the students had left. After they had all left, the soldiers checked every tent to make sure that there was no one inside. Then the vehicles and armored cars came to push down the tents and other obstacles. During the whole clearing process, no soldier fired at the people. Someone might ask that if this were the case, why then were armored cars used? This was to make clearing up the blockades at the square more convenient, to create an atmosphere of deterrence, and to prevent ruffians from throwing stones at soldiers. Everything was so transparent to me, but there were still people who believed the voice of America. I asked one of them if any one of the 36 dead students had been killed at the square. No one. They were all killed either blocking roads at crossroads or whilst watching. This reminded me of a farce which occurred in Ningxia Autonomous Region. Some people spread the rumor that 3 students from Ningxia University had been crushed to death by military vehicles at Tiananmen Square. So, students held a mourning ceremony and a protest demonstration for them. But later, 2 of the 3 students returned alive to Yinchuan, capital of the region, whilst the other one was staying safe and sound in his home in Beijing. Experiences of a song composer. Before the clear-up of the square, a few student representatives went to negotiate with the martial law troops. On August 17th, song composer Hou Dejian, one of their representatives, appeared on TV. He told reporters in his home what he had experienced when leaving the square before dawn on June 4th. He said that Tiananmen Square was in chaos on the night of June 3rd. Students held different opinions about leaving the square. After midnight, the students went to gather round the monument to the people's heroes. Amongst them were himself and 3 other people who had held a 72-hour hunger strike. He said that many people, including people over 30 years old, like the 4 of them, were not very cool-headed. Then, 2 doctors from the Red Cross had suggested that they go to negotiate with the martial law troops. At about 3 o'clock in the morning of June 4th, Hou Dejian and another hunger striker, accompanied by 2 Red Cross doctors, took an ambulance and went over to the martial law troops. On Chang'an Avenue, north of the square, their ambulance was stopped by the troops. A political commissar came to talk with them, telling them that a passageway had been left at the southeast corner of the square for the students to withdraw by. Hou Dejian came back to the monument, asking the students to leave. For the time being, the students were taking the decision to retreat or not by a spoken vote. Hou could not decide whose side got a louder voice, but he didn't care too much. He pulled at some students, asking them to go. Many students started to walk towards the southeast of the square. At that time, both the soldiers and students were very nervous, as they had no idea what the other side was going to do to them. Some soldiers pointed their guns to the front. When Hou Dejian made gestures asking them to point their guns upwards, most of the soldiers did so. He said that during the whole process, he didn't see any student, civilian, or soldier being killed, or any tank or armored car crush the crowd. He saw 3 or 4 tanks outside the square. He said he heard the gunshots and saw that tear gas shells were being fired at the southwest corner of the square. But he said that the gunshots were being fired into the air or at the loudspeakers on the monument. Hou said that he was lying on a stretcher when leaving the square, with the last group of people. I was covered by a coat, and I was scared when I heard the gunshots, he said. But the doctor told me not to panic because they were only shooting into the air. After leaving the square on June 4th, he went to hide in a residence for an agency in Beijing. During this period of time, he gradually learned what was happening outside and decided to leave the agency. He went home on August 16th. A teacher's account. On September 4th, the account of a teacher who saw the whole process of clearing up the square was broadcast over the radio. His name is Kong Xiangzhi, a teacher in the Soft Science Research Institute of the Chinese People's University. The following is his account. On the afternoon of June 3rd, the Autonomous Union of our university was asking people over the loudspeaker to go to every crossroad to block the military vehicles. Being afraid that the students might take some drastic action, I went to Tiananmen Square by bike at 10 p.m. The loudspeakers of the martial law troops and the AUUS were both broadcasting at the square. Someone was calling on people to deal with violence by means of violence and to defend the right of every citizen prescribed by the Constitution. I was very angry at hearing this. This was tantamount to pushing the students to the brink of death. So I wanted to argue with him, but was stopped by the student pickets. Even when I showed my ID card, they didn't allow me to go in there. After a while, I found our university's tent, but there was no one I knew. When the students who were there saw my university badge, they came up to talk with me. I told them that the government was going to take action that night and hoped that they could persuade the others to go back. But they thought there was little possibility. One of them told me that the situation on the nights of May 19th and May 20th was much grimmer. I asked them not to do anything in self-defense if the troops came to clear up the square. I also asked them to go back to school as soon as possible. They agreed. At about 12:10 a.m., the troops marched in from West Chang'an Avenue. I was sitting on the steps outside the west entrance of the Great Hall of the People. When the troops marched towards the square, I saw a group of people throwing rocks at them. When a few soldiers went up to them, they ran southwards. These soldiers fired into the air. Then some other soldiers came up, but they didn't shoot at the crowds, otherwise I would have been shot, since I was now on the sidewalk. I gave up the idea of getting my bike. I wanted to go to the square and ask the students to leave. When I walked to the east side of the south entrance of the Great Hall of the People, I saw a formation of soldiers marching from south to north, and a tank driving slowly. The square was now under the control of the army. I dared not get in there any more. By then the students had all gathered around the monument. After a little while, I walked to the east entrance of the Great Hall where several hundred soldiers were sitting, and some people were talking with them. The atmosphere seemed friendly. When I saw someone binding up a wound for a young soldier, I went up to help and asked him how he had been wounded. He told me he had been hit by rocks. He also told me that many of his comrades had also been wounded. I saw many soldiers' heads, arms, or hands were bound up with gauze. I told him that I believed that the majority of the students and residents would not do this. He agreed with me. Then an officer came to talk with us. He said that the troops would never open fire on the masses or the students. At about 3:30 a.m., the troops began to fall in. The officer then said to his men, "We are going in to clear up the square. Now, I declare that no one is permitted to shoot at the students or masses. At the moment, this represents the highest discipline." I shook hands with the soldiers in the front row one by one and wished them good luck. When I was about to leave, the officer came up to me and said to me, shaking my hand, "Please tell the teachers of your school we will never shoot the students. Please don't worry." When I heard this, I didn't know what to say. I only said, "Thank you. Thank you." At about 4:10, all the lights at the square went out. A lot of soldiers came out from the east entrance of the Great Hall. Some of them sat down outside the hall, and some walked to the north. I sat down to watch under the pine trees, feeling excited and nervous. I was nervous because this was the first time I had seen so many soldiers carrying guns, and I didn't know how they were going to clear up the square. I was excited because the 50-day-long farce was almost coming to an end. People could now relax. Before long, students lit a few fires around the monument and the flames went up to the sky. I heard from the loudspeaker that Ho De-jian and a few others were repeatedly asking the students to leave, and said they had taken up the matter with the martial law troops. At about 4:30, the martial law troops announced over the loudspeaker, "Attention, students. We have agreed to your appeal. We will allow you to leave peacefully." The announcement was broadcast over and over again. At about 4:50, the students around the monument began to leave. I looked around and saw that there was almost no one in sight. So I came back with the students. That was at 5:05 a.m. This was what I saw at the time. No one was killed throughout the whole process. Some people with ulterior motives who had fled abroad spread rumors that Tiananmen Square had been a bloodbath, and that they had had to crawl out from underneath the corpses, which was sheer nonsense. They wanted to cheat people of goodwill all over the world and to slander our great socialist republic. But this will only turn out to be a futile effort, for facts speak louder than words. End of chapter 2.